Ever since my arrival in the Japanese Canadian community, people have been asking for the perspectives of younger Japanese Canadians.
Yeah.
It took a long time for me to wrap my head around what I was feeling and thinking, but finally I'm ready to tell you. This is my perspective. To begin, I turned to a conversation that I had just earlier this year with my grandma.
Hey!
Hey, Grandma. Remember when I was working with the SRO collaborative and living here? And I would sometimes ask you about Powell and the lion? And I can't remember. I remember you said, all I can remember is that you said that Blue Grandma used to make you take her pies, and that you had to bust down to Powell, and then you go to the lion and up the stairs to the right, and then down the hall, and it's in the middle on the left.
Yeah.
I don't remember anything else that you told me. And I recently heard from Wendy, and she said that there's people in the hotel now who, the city of Vancouver, the government, doesn't keep all the records if they don't think it's important. And of course, the city rarely thinks that people in the downtown east side are important. So there's not a lot of history in the archives. And I was wondering if you can remember anything about going, what it felt like, or in the building, or
It was pretty clean.
any other tenants that you met, or anything.
And there was a bathroom right at the end.
Bathroom right at the end?
Yeah, and everybody shared.
Okay. At the end of, if you continued
The
past
street,
her room?
Yeah. Right at the
I see.
north end. No,
South end, I guess, then.
yeah, south end, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's stairs that went up.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember if there was a door, or I can't seem to remember there was somebody sitting on the left side.
But you said you remember it being clean?
Yeah.
And this was in
No.
the 80s?
No.
70s?
No, it was very clean.
In the 70s and 80s it was very clean?
Yeah, very clean. Very nice. It
Interesting.
wasn't dirty or anything.
My grandma and I were talking about a single-room occupancy hotel called the Lion, where, in the 70s and 80s, my great-grandma, my grandma's mother-in-law, Kime Belcher, known affectionately as Blue Grandma in our family, used to live. I was asking my grandma about what she could remember of the Lion because my friend, Wendy, had asked me about it. Wendy is an activist and community organizer who lives in the downtown east side and who started an organization called the Downtown Eastside SRO Collaborative. The SRO in their name stands for Single Room Occupancy, 3 words used to describe the kinds of old hotels that so distinguish the downtown east side. These are buildings that were predominantly built in the early 1900s, but due to decades of neglect on the part of governments, innkeepers, landlords, and managers have fallen into disrepair. Many of these SROs, though in many cases they are now extremely dilapidated, stand as some of the last remaining housing stock for people living on social assistance and fixed incomes. Now, the SRO Collaborative is made up of all kinds of organizers, many of them SRO tenants themselves, and all of whom together are dedicated to increasing the habitability, so the structure, the safety, the dignity of SROs, while supporting the tenants who dwell within them. So fighting evictions, holding landlords accountable, training neighbors in how to use naloxone, which can be administered to reverse an opioid overdose, and so on. Although the collaborative is made up of all kinds of organizers, none of them are Japanese Canadian. Not Wendy, and not anyone else. Neither, to my knowledge, are any of the tenants who live in the SROs in which the collaborative organizes. So then you might be wondering, why am I talking about this? Why at Powell Street Festival, a Japanese Canadian arts and culture festival, am I talking about this SRO hotel called the Lion, in which my great-grandma happened to once live, in which her daughter-in-law, my grandma, once visited, all to get hopefully some snippets of hotel history to pass on to Wendy and a bunch of other organizers, none of whom are Japanese Canadian. And in many ways, this video is about answering that question.
Have you revisited that article by Masumi Izumi?
The voice you just heard is the voice of my friend, Sho. I knew I couldn't make this video or write this letter or whatever this is on my own, so I asked my friends, Sho Yamagushiku and Nicole Yakashiro, to help me. And the article that Sho is referring to here is actually a book chapter, written by Kyoto-based North American Studies scholar Masumi Izumi. The chapter is included in a book called Nikkei in the Pacific Northwest, and the chapter itself is called Reclaiming and Reinventing Powell Street, Reconstruction of the Japanese Canadian Community in Post-World War II Vancouver. That's exactly what it's about, how we Japanese Canadians reclaimed or reinvented Powell Street after the Second World War, particularly during the 1970s. Izumi's telling of this history is interesting, but I was struck by one specific fact.
What I was struck by was the fact that Take-san had a job because of Dira. Like, Dira made Tonarigumi start because they paid Take-san to organize, and he went door knocking in SROs.
Take-san is Takeo Yamashiro, well known in the Japanese Canadian community as a shakuhachi master, and for starting Tonarigumi, the Japanese Canadian Volunteers Association, in the 1970s in Powell Street. Take and other organizers, notably Jun Hamada, started Tonarigumi in Powell Street to support the Issei, including, incidentally, my great-grandma, who had returned to the neighborhood after the war and who, at the time, predominantly lived in SROs. And DIRA is the Downtown Eastside Residents Association, an organization started in 1973 by Bruce Erickson, Libby Davies, and Jean Swanson, dedicated to advocating for the Downtown Eastside community, and particularly SRO tenants, since so many residents of the Downtown Eastside lived in SROs. Now, I knew that Take-san had started Tonarigumi in the 1970s, and I knew that DIRA was active around that time. But until reading Izumi's book chapter, I didn't know that it was DIRA who paid Take-san initially to go to the SROs on Powell, to knock on doors, and to make sure people's needs were met. I didn't know, in other words, that it was DIRA who first paid Take-san to organize.
Like, actually the history of Tonarigumi is very different than what the organizers that I know are doing now, in some ways, but in other ways it's like viscerally connected.
Yeah.
And that is not a connection, like, for all the things that we say we use to make a claim to place, like that connection is not one of them. You know, it's like, it's not at the center, and it really could and should be, particularly when we make claims to Powell explicitly.
Yeah.
Since that's where they were knocking on doors.
And when I say they, I mean Take-san, but also other organizers, including a handful of sansei, many of whom are still active in our community today. In other words, Dira paid Take, and Take's organizing worked. It drew others to the cause of supporting the Issei in Powell. Energies grew. And as energies grew, for these sansei that got involved in the wake of the civil rights movement and just as multiculturalism was arriving in Canada, an idea emerged. These sansei thought that it might be an idea to actually gather as Japanese Canadians in the neighborhood from which we were once forcibly removed, and in 1977, took it upon themselves to start Powell Street Festival. Here was a space where the Issei who were still living in Powell could gather together publicly and be themselves, speak Japanese, eat takoyaki, listen to taiko, but also where sansei could do so too, and nisei, everyone. Here was a place where after being pushed out of home, Japanese Canadians could return and could return together. Powell Street Festival is now in its 45th year. Literally thousands of people attend the festival, enjoying the Japanese Canadian food, art, and culture that the festival has to offer. But I can't help but wonder, would we have this festival had Dira not hired Take-san to organize in Powell 50-odd years ago? Asking this question is not to say that our community would be nowhere without Dira having paid Take to go door knocking in SROs on Powell in the 70s, but it is to say that it's a problem, if you ask me, that we never talk about Dira. It's a telling omission. Because the omission of Dira from the story of Tonarigumi, and thus of Powell Street Festival, is the omission of how the downtown Eastside community helped us. They, through Dira, helped us return to Powell, supported us to support each other, showed us how we mattered, how our Japanese Canadianness, our past, our memories, our story mattered at a time when many Japanese Canadians were convinced otherwise. Why would we omit this tangible, real, change-making act of solidarity between our two communities? For me, the inclusion of Dira in this story about Tonarigumi and Powell Street Festival made something click. My sense of felt connection to the downtown Eastside, and more specifically to SROs, SRO tenants, and the SRO Collaborative, an organization that is in many ways a contemporary version of Dira, is not random. Rather, it's a reflection of a history that my own community never told me. And that's not to accuse people who knew this particular fact for doing something wrong by not telling me that it was Dira who initially paid Take to organize. On the contrary, I can see why no one told me. Frankly, I can see how any sansei who volunteered with Take in the 70s and who might have known that Take was initially paid by Dira might have chose not to bother sharing this fact, because why would they think that anyone in this community would care? Like me, now, though perhaps even more so then, spending time in the downtown Eastside, not to eat takoyaki, but to work with local residents, including SRO tenants, doesn't really make sense. It doesn't seem, in other words, like a Japanese Canadian thing to do. Whereas sansei might have endured outright rebuttal from Nisei in the 70s, I don't experience rebuttal now. What I experience is actually a strange form of affirmation. When it comes to our community, my working in the downtown Eastside goes mostly ignored, except for by a handful of people who are, on their own ways, desperately trying to do their part to support our neighbors too, And all of this work on my part and on the part of a handful of others to the broader community is just, they're doing that. Until people want to make a historical or political claim to Powell or want to think through our relations with the downtown East Side, and then we, the few of us who do any kind of work in the neighborhood, are called. We are called because we are Japanese Canadian, but we do work in the downtown East Side, and the idea is that we can tell the rest of the community about that experience. And that's frankly a problematic dynamic, but that's the one we're in right now, and we can do it, and we do it, and we try to do a decent job of it, refusing the idea that the downtown East Side is some sort of zoo to be examined by outsiders, and insisting instead that the work we do is just straight up necessary, and here's why, and that sort of thing. But there is this dynamic, and this dynamic has a lot to do with being clean and being dirty. It's not a coincidence that when I asked my grandma about what she could remember of the lion, she emphasized repeatedly that the lion was clean. Of course, that's just how my grandma remembers the hotel, but it points to the undeniable fact that when it comes to our community's relationship with the downtown East Side, who and what is considered or is actually clean, and who and what is considered or is actually dirty, is a big deal.
I think
the voice you're hearing now is my friend Nicole.
What's interesting about like cleanliness and dirt is like the material dimensions, but also like the social and political work of it. Because you can't deny that due to systemic neglect, that the neighborhood is dirty. But it's the meanings that are attached to dirtiness and the work that our neighbor, like our community has consistently been doing to identify as like the opposite of that. Yeah, I mean, like in my paper that I wrote, George Nita talks a lot about like, yeah, it was very clean. First thing. What was Powell Street like that? Or what was it like? Very clean. Very clean. Just it's that's doing political work, whether we want to call it political or not. And I also think it's interesting to think about it more than just in the context of Powell Street and thinking about it as like the more I learn about Japanese imperialism and its ties to what happens in what we call North America.
I was glad that Nicole brought up those ties, because those ties are important. Because we didn't learn to value cleanliness the ways that we do just from the violence we endured in Canada. On the contrary, we arrived with certain ideas about cleanliness very much in tow. Sho, who is Okinawan, offers his thoughts about cleanliness in the context of Japanese imperialism.
I mean, historically, Okinawan, and I mean, I know less about an Ainu context, but like dirtiness was built into backwardness and sort of like uncivilized, but also like dirty, and like didn't wear shoes. And these things were very much like narratives of cleanliness in terms of how Japanese like indigenous bodies were racialized. And I think that right now there's a fixation on that dirtiness of Okinawans, which, because there's like recently in Okinawa, there's been an Okinawa boom, like in Tokyo and these places. So what went from histories of perversion then got transmuted into like cultural interest and literally is called, and in an academic text is called a boom of Okinawan shit. Like you'll read and there'll be the heading will be Okinawa boom. And so what that means is that for the first time, Okinawan cultural arts were in vogue in places like in Okinawan neighborhoods, like I think this is in Osaka and like places like that, like working class neighborhoods, like there would be like Sanshin and other cultural arts teachers, but the majority of people learning are people who are not Okinawan. And so these classes then like what shifted from like racialized labor of like Koreans and Okinawans then becomes like culturally desirable. And so I would say that left, like any sort of organizing now comes generally in the context of that of fixation with that dirtiness and studying it as something redeemable. And then what happens is the fact that Japanese bodies have been constructed as clean, and we all still think that and believe that, never gets brought into our like field of vision. And so I'm actually way more interested in, like, if Okinawans were racialized as dirty, that still lives in all of our lineages but was suppressed. And you were all like conversely, then there's a racialization as clean, but no one ever will like breach that territory and say, what does it mean to think about how that is also a false narrative? And so I'm very invested in that, like that, if I want people to do that work and not study Okinawans. I can read something about, I wrote this Instagram post after I went to Japan. Like, so I was in Okinawa and then I went to Japan and I stayed in Tokyo. And so I wrote this. In the West, Japan is often celebrated for its efficiency, cleanliness, and order. From the public transportation to the cuisine to the customer service. We are left awestruck and a little weary that another world might have achieved a mess of concrete, customs, and technology that rivals what we call our own. This efficiency is a thinly veiled euphemism for colonization, and the quickness and bounty that Japan claims ownership of is without a doubt the end result of generations of exploited labor and land of darker-skinned peoples who lie to the south. These, the unmodern people who those with blood that bleeds Japanese imagine themselves in opposition to, those who inhabit exotic places of wonder and lack, lost souls in need of guidance and aid. Without a doubt, whiteness has its own logic and desires here, but the West is confused, for it wears a yellow face. As diasporic subjects in Japan's empire, we find ourselves yearning for roots, sifting through cultural practices, and bowing at shrines in hopes to call forth an ancestor who might welcome us back. But these symbols we yearn for are often the signifiers of Japan's long and painful journey to empire. Red gates, red suns, and ghostly complexions, building blocks in the creation of an indisputable race descended through the empire, a million souls working in modern and efficient unison. For those indoctrinated in the nation, it must be a patient and humble journey to find elders and prayers that act in right relation to set us free from the grinding binds of empire. It is this gracious return to land, not nation, that will fill our hungry throats with clean water and untie the knots the white man forced into our tongues. Then we can create a new world where the rising sun sets one final time, and those who lost their lives for the nation's falsehoods will fall from the sky back into the homes that were meant to be bodies, not cages, to live anew, complete, free, and untethered.
We Japanese Canadians have spent a lot of time, decades in fact, emphasizing that we are Japanese Canadian. As a community, we are deeply attached to our sense of ourselves as Canadian. But the truth is that that first word, Japanese, is important. It's crucial. Not just because it was our Japaneseness that the state and many of our neighbors hated and therefore sought to expel, but because our Japaneseness also means that we carry with us the legacies of Meiji-era colonial imperial Japan. Nicole summarizes.
What people don't understand about racism is that it's not the process of racialization isn't always like an overtly negative thing, right? Like it's also like, I'm better because I am Japanese, whatever. It's just so, I can't help but think that like, it's not only about how people perceive folks who live in the downtown east side as dirty, but how we as Japanese Canadians specifically see ourselves as very clean. And that does work too. So it's, yeah, I think I'm interested in both those questions, but I do think we need to evaluate, why are we like, what is cleanliness giving us? What does it afford us? And Yeah, what harm does that do?
A lot of harm, some of which has affected and still affects Powell Street in very real-world ways. For example, if we return to Masumi Izumi's book chapter, even as she recounts the inception of Powell Street Festival and what she calls the Japanese Canadian community's basically rightful return to Powell Street, she also highlights the stakes of that return. Izumi shows how Japanese Canadians returned to Powell Street, largely because we were, by the 70s and 80s, constructed as the model minority and thus imagined to be clean, would ironically, in the name of commemoration for our unjust displacement, risk displacing then present-day downtown Eastside residents from the very neighborhood from which we were once forcibly removed. Now, the city of Vancouver's desire for us to be or to have some presence in Powell Street became clear in the 1970s under the auspices of a national initiative called the Neighborhood Improvement Program, an initiative designed to rehabilitate neighborhoods across Canada, particularly via the removal of so-called blight.
Blight is death to a city. And these dwellings, built with such hope and care at the turn of the century, are dying board by board, and the property they occupy dies with them.
What you're seeing now is, and what you just heard was, a part of a promotional video produced by the City of Vancouver, along with the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, in 1964. I've included it here to show that even before the federal government introduced the Neighborhood Improvement Program, the municipal government, the City of Vancouver, had already conceived of the neighborhood that we now know as the downtown Eastside as blight, as dirty and decaying, even dying, and was clearly already deeply invested in improving, effectively removing these parts of the city. And so, when the federal government introduced the Neighborhood Improvement Program, it was the perfect catalyst for the city to attempt to raise much of what we now know as the downtown Eastside to the ground. In her book chapter, Masumi Izumi shows how these attempts took place in Powell Street specifically. On Wednesday, May 12, 1976, to facilitate the Neighborhood Improvement Program in the downtown Eastside, a committee was formed, the Oppenheimer Area Planning Committee. Izumi explains that this committee included both owners and tenants from the area's commercial and industrial facilities and residential buildings, as well as employed workers, and that, in addition, a representative was selected from the Chinese and Japanese communities, respectively. Interestingly, she also points out that the planning committee paid special attention to the Japanese Canadian presence in the area. For example, the committee concluded, "There are not many Japanese people still living in the area, perhaps 100 senior citizens, but there are many retail outlets and social/cultural facilities catering specifically to the wider Japanese population in the city. Because of the historical importance of this group, as well as their intimate relationship with this area, encouragement should be extended to them to strengthen their presence in the area for the benefit of the neighborhood and the city as a whole." Considering the fact, says Izumi, that the number of ethnic Japanese residents was less than 3% of the local population, the needs of the Japanese Canadian community were substantially overrepresented in the Neighborhood Improvement Program in this area. My question is why? Even after the Neighborhood Improvement Program was terminated, the local government continued to pay special attention to potential for Japanese Canadian presence in the Powell Street area, initially through the Powell Street Commercial Beautification Scheme. From 1979 to 1980, writes Izumi, city officials met local and ethnic representatives to determine support for a possible upgrading of a portion of Powell Street with a Japanese theme, partially to recognize the important historic and cultural contributions of Japanese Canadians in the Oppenheimer area, and partially to provide an impetus for the revival of the commercial retail restaurant aspect of Japanese Canadians, tourists, and others. This kind of commercial development represents some of the city's early attempts to commercialize, to turn Powell Street into a Japantown or Little Tokyo, a tourist attraction in the name of commemoration, but ultimately to gentrify. In other words, to clean up the downtown East Side. Some Japanese Canadians opposed this. But even those that opposed it did so on grounds that the recreation of a Japantown or a Little Tokyo was not desirable because, basically, such a recreation would be, in a word, dirty. Ken Matsune, who sat on the Oppenheimer Citizens Committee, insisted that he remembers city staff saying, "You will return it into a Japanese village." But that was never our goal. We wanted to be treated like everyone else. We don't want to be ghettoized. Matsune's concern reflects the politics of the time, as well as the memory of once having been, to use his word, ghettoized. Like in the first half of the 20th century, when Japanese Canadians were restricted to the eastern edges of Vancouver precisely because white, wealthy Vancouverites saw them, us, as dirty. But no matter how you look at it, what this shows is the importance of cleanliness to Japanese Canadian identity. Long told that we were dirty, to recuperate our sense of self, we imagined one another as clean. And it is because we were so successful at this, at constructing ourselves, our community as clean, that when we claim Powell Street as our historic home, which we still do to this day, things happen, both to Powell Street itself as a neighborhood, and therefore also to the people who now live there. So in other words, our cleanliness, combined with our claiming Powell Street as our historic home, at least in the way that we often do now, is part of what makes it possible for the city to rehabilitate, to revitalize, to beautify, to gentrify, to clean up the downtown East Side in the name of commemoration for Japanese Canadians, but in effect, facilitating yet another forced removal. Understandably, we are quite attached to our sense of cleanliness. Like Sho and Nicole, I do think that attachment does in part come through the generations from Imperial Japan. But, as Ken Matsune's resistance to being ghettoized reveals, it also comes from our experiences in Canada. Here's how I see it. Japanese immigration to Canada began in the late 1800s. People settled predominantly in different parts of the Lower Mainland, including New Westminster, the Fraser Valley, Vancouver, as well as a specific part of what is now Richmond, an area called Steveston, and Victoria, often working in trades, industrial, and service jobs, since racist laws excluded Japanese and in fact all Asian people from working really anywhere else. The late 1800s and early 1900s, then, were difficult times. Racism was very real and affected people's lives in all kinds of ways, from the level of law and policy to just walking down the street, going fishing, getting groceries, basically people's everyday. As Asian immigration to Canada continued, not just from Japan, but other countries too, notably China and India, racism on the West Coast intensified. The early decades of the 20th century were distinguished by this intense and rising anti-Asian racism. By the time World War II broke out, a specific kind of anti-Japanese racism took hold. Now, the presence of Japanese people, many of whom were naturalized Canadians or who were born in Canada, was not just a matter of these then imagined to be dirty people ruining the West Coast, but a matter, white settlers and politicians determined,
of national security. It was under these conditions that when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in 1942, the Government of Canada labeled Japanese Canadians enemy aliens and passed several orders in council under the War Measures Act that would eventually lead to the forced displacement, internment, dispossession, and subsequent dispersal of Japanese Canadians. It wasn't until April 1st, 1949 that Japanese Canadians were allowed back on the West Coast, by which time thousands of people had already been repatriated, a word that our community has frequently had to correct to deported, for this word, deported, more truly expresses what happened when people were sent to Japan. And thousands more people, by the spring of 1949, had already been forcibly dispersed by the government, who sought to systematically separate Japanese Canadians and ensure the destruction of our communities, so scattered across the prairies, Ontario, and Quebec. No wonder, then, that by the time the Sansei came of age, several wanted to pursue redress for what had happened to their parents and grandparents, and hence, the redress movement was born. It would be a serious understatement to say that the redress movement was itself incredibly difficult, full of rifts, rage, and betrayal, not just between our community and the Government of Canada, but within our community too. In fact, in hindsight, I think it was the violence within our community that caused some of the most considerable damage. But nevertheless, the Sansei organized effectively enough that on September 22nd, 1988, redress was achieved. And since the achievement of federal redress, we have celebrated this moment in our history. And that makes sense. Redress was and always will be an enormous accomplishment. Not just for our community, but for other communities too, since as we often say, federal Japanese-Canadian redress is the watershed moment in Canada for what we now recognize as the Age of Apology. But at the same time, from my perspective, the achievement and subsequent celebration of redress is also troubling. As I have heard so many people who I will add I respect very much, say, we won redress on the basis of a legal argument about citizenship. The state, it was determined, violated the rights of its own citizens. Citizens who, we are quick to add, did nothing wrong, who had committed no crime, citizens who were good, innocent, citizens whose criminal records, in fact, through the redress settlement, were cleared. That is to say, through redress, we got a clean record. To celebrate redress in so many ways, then, is to celebrate our cleanliness. I have come to the conclusion that we need to seriously question the logics of redress. Not because we were wrong to seek it, or because we now need to wholly disavow it, but because, like many efforts to fight for justice, the logics of redress are limited. I am not the first person to question the logics of redress. In 1999, cultural scholar Kirsten McAllister articulated how during the redress campaign, Japanese Canadians realized that it was politically necessary to write themselves into the nation. They needed, said McAllister, to be seen as Canadian citizens whose parents and grandparents were also Canadian, as opposed to new immigrants, Asians, Japanese, or the Yellow Peril. What Kirsten is saying here is that in order to achieve redress, Japanese Canadians had to become Japanese Canadians. Once seen so unequivocally as foreigners, as enemy aliens who were violently excluded from the story of the nation, from large parts of Canadian society, and from any sense of Canadianness, we then, if we wanted to redress that exclusion, had to commit to Canada, to become Japanese Canadians. As literary scholar Roy Miki puts it, Japanese Canadians were themselves formed by the call for redress. And so,
I want to question the logics of redress, because having our community's identity defined so decisively, officially, and restrictively as Japanese Canadians diminishes our capacity to truly imagine and then work toward justice in our time. So, for example, when people who are unhoused or under threat of displacement in the very neighborhood from which we were once displaced emphasize, often composed, polite, respectful, sometimes not, sometimes yelling, sometimes in tears, the need for safe, habitable, pension and welfare rate social housing, we do next to nothing. When people who use drugs ask and then beg and then scream at the top of their lungs for a safe drug supply, explicate in scientific, cultural, political, whatever kind of detail you want why a safe drug supply is fundamentally necessary for justice in our city, we do next to nothing. When people who do sex work implore governments for legal and institutional changes necessary to keep sex workers safe, we do next to nothing. I worry that this is because we have developed a sense of self as right, good, innocent, and clean that depends on other people's being wrong, bad, criminal, and dirty. Dear community, I am worried that our own sense of self is so precarious, so paper thin, that we have become accustomed to protecting it at all costs. Even if that means abandoning our neighbors, at least to suffering, often to death. And I'm worried because to abandon, or at least mostly abandon our neighbors on the one hand, and to proclaim never again and justice in our time on the other hand, is to kid ourselves. It seems to me that we so desperately want an identity, a community, a place to belong, or at least something to be, that we have clung to Japanese Canadianness, whatever that is, and actually foreclosed other opportunities to grow. I think that we need to get to a place where our sense of self is so strong that we don't need the nation to confirm it. Where when we say we stand in solidarity, we can feel each other doing that. Unshakable in our conviction that we don't need inclusion in the nation in order to know ourselves, or to fight with our neighbors for real, deep, unflinching liberation. So, what does this all mean in the context of Powell Street? Nicole explains.
Yeah, I mean, like what I'm trying to say, hopefully, is thinking about like the core of liberalism is like self-possession and property ownership. And so I think a part of that is like the inability to critique the impulse to possess Powell Street in the wake of dispossession, right? Like I just feel like that it just clouds all judgment because it can be seen as justice. Like there's an argument that occupying Powell Street is a form of empowerment for Japanese Canadians, and I think that's at that point. Yeah, I just feel like folks don't know how else to. Yeah, don't really know how else to live, or like belonging doesn't necessitate possession in that mode. But I think people think it does. And we're all still searching for belonging. And none of that has worked.
What Nicole is suggesting is that despite the fact that we were displaced from our homes, that being replaced into our historic homes is perhaps not the answer. That despite the fact that we were dispossessed, that becoming repossessed is perhaps not the answer. At the very least, what she suggests is that even if part of grappling with our trauma entails these kinds of replacements to and repossessions of Powell, that is very likely not the whole answer. Because if it were, then what am I doing here? And what is she doing here? And what is Sho doing here? What are any of us younger Japanese Canadians, often recent arrivals to the community, doing here? And why did so many people work so hard to get us here? I ask myself, if replacement and repossession are not the answer, or are not the whole answer, then what is? And once again, I find myself turning to that conversation I had with my grandma. Man, I can't believe that hotel was at all clean in the 80s, and then
It was
so
very
quickly
clean.
it's very not clean anymore.
Oh, yeah, the stairs are nice and shiny.
Shiny?
Yeah.
Wow, that's beyond clean.
Oh, no, it was clean. And then, if not, then Grandma would have lit into them, right?
Oh, really?
She's like that, right?
Yeah.
Why you no clean? She would have lit into them. It was very clean.
Mm.
Even the mother would have told them off.
She would have given the landlord a piece of her mind.
Yeah. Not clean. You clean. She would have told them.
All right.
No right. She would say. No, it's very clean.
Hearing my grandma tell me about my great-grandma, how she would have lit into the landlord if the lion had been dirty, brings me joy. Because what I hear in this story is not a sense that because she was Japanese, she was entitled to a clean space, but rather that because she was a person, a human being, and a human being who mattered, because she was a human being, she deserved to live in a clean space. And that's the tough part. Clean spaces themselves are not a problem. Like Nicole pointed out about dirtiness, so much of the power of cleanliness comes from the meanings that are attached to it. Innocence, rightness, goodness. Put together then, cleanliness and dirtiness create a power dynamic that works in the same way as white supremacy and racism. And really, they're all intertwined. The meanings that we make out of the worlds that we live in are incredibly powerful things. Because of the meanings attached to cleanliness, innocence, goodness, rightness, and at this point I would add whiteness and wealth, as soon as you clean a place, the supposedly innocent, good, right, white, and wealthy people move in. And the supposedly criminal, bad, wrong, non-white, and poor people get forced out. It's not like people in the downtown Eastside want to live in unsafe conditions. It's that the systems and logics that we have, systems and logics that we Japanese Canadians help to uphold, make it basically impossible for the low-income downtown Eastside community members to stay once the neighborhood has been cleaned up. In fact, cleaning up the neighborhood, as it was in the 40s and 60s in Chinatown and Hogan's Alley, and in the 70s and 80s in Powell, and all throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, has always been about forcing particular people out of the neighborhood. So, if Japanese Canadian replacement in or repossession of Powell is not the whole answer, and I agree with Nicole that it's not, then I would suggest that the whole answer might include something like exploring what lays beyond the Japanese Canadianness, the attachment to cleanliness, the goodness, and ultimately overcoming the fear that we are not enough, Not good enough, not hardworking enough, not white enough, not whatever enough. In fact, I insist we are so much more than an identity. We are so much more than Japanese Canadian. I'm going to close with a poem. It's a Sento poem. I learned about Sento poems from my friend, Erika Isamura. And Sento poems are poems made of other poems, and poetry is big in the downtown Eastside. So the one that I have written borrows lines from Mark Toyama, Tora, Diane Wood, Tome, Rupert B., S. Miller, Fred Arentz, Lee Donahue, R. Lowen, Jiang Chang, Judy McGuire, Robin Livingstone, Daniel Rajala, Dave McConnell, Sheila Baxter, Mike Guy, aka Slacker, Phoenix Winter, Stephen Litton, Muriel Marjorie, Antoinette Rea, Don Larson, Rachel Rose, Jill Seren, Cindy McBride, Nympha Angel Eyes Francis, Sandy Cameron, Claudius Ivan Planadin, Bud Osborne, Jacqueline Anghara Gilles, Tracy Morrison, The Right to Remain, Kathy Lau, Michael Clegg, H. Walter, and Anne Ray Valls. Powell Street knows of real people in a real neighborhood, sharing tobacco or spare change, holding on to each other for dear life, at Main and Hastings, mainly Hastings. Mainly in these streets, there remains connection for all our relations, from a familiar place. That's how Powell Street knows. Powell Street knows all she wants is kitchens where salads are tossed through waves of sitar and songbirds. She ended up with a black eye. Put your boots on and get ready to march. It can break your heart. Powell Street knows. Powell Street knows sweat dripping off the walls and chairs, in and out of cracks, west on Hastings, into the early fall morn. Under the cherry trees of Oppenheimer Park, the horror, the angst, the sorrow, Powell Street knows. Powell Street knows what normal is. Smoking cigarettes, fanning my hard-earned cash. There's no good feeling here, but recollections, dim as a dust-stricken room. There's stuff here of more significance. Tent City about 400, playing with dark thoughts. Powell Street knows. Powell Street knows we need a new map. It's urgent. 1,000 crosses in Oppenheimer Park. Dirty, damaged, different. Now filled with love. History's coming to life. I lower my whole body down, crouch my head, aching knees and pounding chest from the aftershock. The effect, drawing out the last long note.